Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ma'am. I'm here to introduce our topic, which is the foreign policy and diplomacy. In the first part of our topic, we will be discussing about foreign policy, national interests, and types of criteria. To give you a brief explanation what is foreign policy, a foreign policy is the decision or actions and goals that the state pursue towards the outside world. State adopts a foreign policy to achieve and promote their national interest. Now that we mentioned national interest, a national interest is a raison d'etat or meaning the reason of state. Or basically, it is how a state will justify its action and policy towards other states in an international level. Now let's proceed to the types of criteria. We have 6 types of criteria. First, we have the ideological criteria. Here, they may identify their friends or enemies' countries. For an example, during the Cold War, there are many countries who established cooperation and conflict with other countries due to the ideology of communism and capitalism. For the next one is the moral and legal criteria. Here, the states are expected to act morally. While in pragmatic criteria, it leans much more on this scientific analysis of cost and benefit and merit and demerit in your country. While the professional advancement criteria is much more opposite to the pragmatic criteria, because here your action may be manipulated and adjusted in consideration of your professional survival and growth. While in the partisan criteria, here you consider the survival and success of your political party. And lastly, we have the foreign dependency criteria. It is much more commonly applies to the less developing countries. And all of this would be much furthermore discussed by my group mates.
Hello everyone, I am Raven Alabin and I will be discussing the national interest. National interest refers to the set of values, orientations, goals, and objectives of a given country, which would like to achieve in its international relations. It has been the major driving force that determines the contents of foreign policy. In short, national interest is the country's needs and wants. There are 3 types of national interest: security interests, ideological interests, and the economic interests. Under economic interests, the government just focuses on the sustaining and growing the economy. In ideological interests, it is matter of the way of living of the people and also the democracy. While in the security, the government ensures the safety of the people from the outside threats. According to Holisty, the future state of affairs and the future set of conditions that governments through individual policy makers aspire to bring about by wielding influence abroad and by changing the sustaining and behaviors of other states. He believes that the national interest should focus on the other states' policy. Power is the ability to influence behaviors of other states. It is underscored as the primary instrument to implement national interests. We all know that the government has the authority or the power on what should the country's in national interests. Chivalry divided into 2, the normative and descriptive. Under normative, it is a set of purpose should seek to realize in the conduct of its foreign relations, while in the descriptive, it is those purposes which the nation or state, through its leadership appears to pursue persistently over time. It is somehow in normative, it is deal with the international interest, while in descriptive, it is the persistently following the national interest. Plato believes in 3 assumptions. Number 1 is that wise and well-informed decisions can be made by few carefully selected individuals who have expressly trained to think in terms of collective good of the state. It's said that only the trained individuals who have the power to participate or give an idea on making the national interest. Number two is that these few individuals who possess awesome and unchecked power will not be collective good of states. Meaning, if you are too good enough individual to help the government in achieving the national interest, but the government didn't want you, you're just useless. Number three is that once socially optimal decisions have been made, they can implemented effectively by loyal, well-trained, and obedient bureaucracies. Meaning, the government will just depend on the individual's assignments. Plato's ideas use as inspiration of dictatorial forms of government. Dictatorial or authoritarian governments assume that they should emphasize substance and wisdom of policies, rather than procedural issues such as public debate, consultation, participation, and criticism. So in dictatorial, the government should focus on their policies rather than gathering some ideas of some events. Defenders of such regimes believe that one person with strength, wisdom, knowledge, and above all, power can make a good decisions rather than participatory decisions making. So they wanted to someone to lead them instead of gathering the idea or the information of others.
Operational philosophy describes how a state plans and acts in international relations depending on its time, location, the state's orientation towards the world around it, and of course its forerunners. In operational philosophy, there are two styles that can be utilized. First is acting in bold, sweeping passion. This is also called as synoptic style. In this, the decision is made by analyzing ideas in a written text, wherein the ideas is discussed and critiqued. And then the decision maker assumes that they have enough knowledge regarding the issue to develop a policy with a confidence that the consequences is predicted and controlled. The second one is acting in cautious, proving, and experimental way, which is also known as incremental and decision making. In here, the decision making is broken down into smaller parts, which is also known as the modeling through. The decisions then are made through trial and error and problem solved. The decision maker assumes that economic and political issues are too complex to make a policy in a bold manner. There are different types of criteria that is used to identify a national interest. The first one is ideological criteria. In here, the states makes an ideological criteria and construct relations with other states based on it. In here, the national interest is shaped under the ideological idea of the regime in power. The states then can identify their allies and enemies using a litmus test. A litmus test is utilized to know whether someone is acceptable or not in a certain organization or states. One example of ideological criteria is Philippines. Since Philippines is a democratic country, therefore the laws that they will implement is under democracy and democratic government. The second criteria is moral and legal criteria. In here, the state is expected to act morally, legally, and to make public decisions accordingly in accordance with international laws. In acting legally, the states must abide all international law to the extent that these laws are identified and accepted in their society. In the whole, the state should act pro to their principles that they are committed to.
Hi, so I'll be discussing the few remaining criteria for defining the national interest. So for the third one, which is the pragmatic criteria, it says here that you look at issues and events around you in the world with sense of prudence and with sort of rationality. Thus, your decisions are made without considering normative issues that involves judgment, judgments, be it good or bad. So, in order to define the national interest in terms of pragmatic criteria, we need to have a broad mindset in which we observe or see the way things around us are in a sensible, logical, or careful way to be able to understand how this kind of events happens without involving our interpersonal or interpersonal issues. It is actually like thinking way deeper in a certain situation rather than just looking at the surface. So, just to recall, to be able to make it more clear to you guys, we actually have a semantics and pragmatics. So, to give you an example, let's just say that I said this to someone, uh, if you ate all that food, it'll make you bigger. So, in a semantic perspective, uh, the person can interpret the situation in a way that if I ate all this food, my current physique might double up, or my weight will double up. But in a pragmatic perspective, you can interpret the situation in two ways. Uh, let's just say I said this to a child. She or he will interpret the situation in a way that if I ate all this food, I can grow bigger. But if I said this to an adolescent who is already an overweight or obese, he or she can interpret the situation in a way more different. So, yeah, that is what pragmatic criteria is about. Same goes with the national interest. So, moving on for the next one, we have the professional advancement criteria. In here, it says that your action may be manipulated and adjusted in consideration of your professional survival and growth. In short, your personal success. Quite often, in large bureaucracies that lack good governance, the trick to success is to play the game and not to rock the boat. This attitude has been referred to cynically as the go along to get along effect. Go along to get along effect. So, I think the best way to describe this is the relevancy of the criteria of the professional advancement criteria to conformist behavior. So when we say conformist behavior, you act or you behave in accordance to social influences, to probably what most people do or what the majority think what is right. You exclude yourself in trouble and you tend to, you know, get away in including yourself in a sense of disapproval from the majority. A good example to expound this clearly is, let's just say you're an MMDA worker and a newbie, and you have partners who has been in the service for years already, and then there's a driver who defy the law or the rules, and of course you need to fine them or give them a penalty, but you see your co-workers being paid under the table. Well, I'm not I'm not generalizing at all, but in what most usual cases, what do? They ignore, or they just go with the flow because they don't want to be in trouble or to have a personal disadvantages, considering that you're just a newbie, so you just ignore the situation and accept what is the norms. So that is what we called professional advancement criteria. So for the next one, we have the partisan criteria, which define as to equate the survival and the success of your political party or ethnic or religious origin with the survival and success of your country. In similar fashion, you may use bureaucratic criteria to prioritize the policy issues. You may tend to equate the interests of your organization with the national interest. So, just to recall again, when we say partisan, it means that you're a follower or a supporter of a certain party or an organization. It also means that partisan criteria is about relating the success of one's own political party to the entire nation's success. So, to give you an example, in our country we have various political parties, and one of that is the PDP Laban or Partido Demokratiko Pilipino, Lakas ng Bayan. If you guys are familiar with, currently our President Rodrigo Duterte is the national chairman of the party. So every political party has an ideology and platform that they want to implement in a way of being elected through their members or etc. Thus, if a certain member, uh, if a certain member of the party was elected and they were able to execute the agenda or the platform through the country, and it turned out to be successful, and then that is what we call the partisan criteria. Moreover, we can also link the agenda of a certain organization to various bureaucratic departments like armies, what else? Foreign affairs, etc. So yeah, that's what partisan criteria is about. So I think this is probably the last one. We have the foreign dependency criteria. In here it says that this criteria usually apply to less developing countries who had fallen under the yoke of colonialism and now, even after political independence, kept the colonial ties with their ex-masters intact. These current countries are still dependent on the ex-colonial states for technical aid, expertise, and technology, sometimes even for security. So, I think the best way to describe this criteria is relating our country, Philippines, to our in terms of our relationship to United States. May it be in aspects of trade and investment, or technologies, military alliances, etc. Obviously, even after the establishment of Philippine independency, after 4 years of colonization of United States, obviously, up until now, we are still relying to them. And As a matter of fact, considering that our country is a less developed country, you know, we uh, implementing or achieving the national interest is way harder because it is harder to defend and to execute because it can be culminated to conflicting lists of ambitions, motivations, needs, or demands. Just what also says here in the module. So, yeah, I think that sums up all the criteria for defining the national interest. I hope you understand. If you have further questions, you can ask me regarding that. So, thank you.
Now we will be understanding about foreign policy and foreign policy behaviors. But first, let us define what is the meaning of foreign policy. Foreign policy refers to the set of objectives and instruments that a state adopts to guide its relation with the outside world. Take note, guys, that a state cannot act just anything it wants. It needs guidelines to help it attain the foreign relations that it needs for its country to be successful. That is why a state needs such instrument and objectives to guide its relation with the outside world. One more meaning about foreign relations is something that a state would like to achieve in its external relation with other countries. Meaning to say, if we could decipher the meaning of this, let us take Philippines and China for example. Philippines decided to have relations with China. That is why many Filipinos are calling our president a dog of China. But if we would look deeper into this situation, we would see that it is really vital for the survival of our country in terms of economics, because we know that China is such a powerful country with much technology advancement, economical advancement, and military advancement, and many more. It is one of the leading countries in the world. That is why we cannot blame our president that it had foreign relations with other countries, because it is what a country needs to achieve its external relations with other countries. Having relations with other countries is really important for a state, because through this it can import and export goods and maintain its global competitiveness. Now, foreign policy also involves specific instruments and tactics that must be employed to realize those objectives and goals. These are the most used instrument of foreign policy. Number one, if you're taking notes, you can take these notes down. Number one, diplomatic bargaining. Number two, economic instruments. Number three, propaganda. Number four, terrorism, or sometimes called sabotage, and use of force or war. Now, we will be just discussing the two most used instrument of this foreign policy. So number one, diplomatic or diplomacy. Diplomatic bargaining or diplomacy. Diplomacy is a process between usually diplomats representing states who engage in private or sometimes public dialogues to pursue their objectives in a peaceful manner. Diplomacy is really important because in here we learn to communicate with other states and propose our different ideas, agendas, and tips for each nation states. Now, for diplomacy to be effective, here are some rules for effective diplomacy. Number one, be realistic. Why? Why do we need to be realistic? Because if we make plans that are not realistic, what's the point of talking this over with other states? That's why we need our plans or dialogues to be feasible, attainable, and realistic. Number two, we must be careful about what we say. Why? Because some words may offend different states or the other side that we are having dialogue to, and this may result to misunderstanding um, and other problems. Number three, we seek common ground. For our dialogues to be smooth and the flow may be natural, we need to consider what would benefit both parties or both nation states that are having dialogue. Um, what would the things that we could both agree on? That's why we need to seek common ground. And number four, understand the other side. You know what? Understanding is really a good virtue because once we understand, we put ourselves in other people's shoe. We learn why they do certain things. We learn that every people, every nation is a good nation. And as we understand the other side, we will create a more peaceful conversation and we would be kind and helpful to each other because we understand them. And the lack of understanding is the major source of wars in countries, in different kinds of countries, because misunderstanding creates tensions in different states, and these tensions may grow and grow and would later on create violence, and after that violence, wars. So we need to be understanding with the other side. Number five, be patient. Not everything that we talk now can be solved later on. Some problems take a really long time to be solved. And once we make dialogues, we need to be patient. We wait and not make hasty decisions and would later on make our nation state suffer or the other nations. Number six, leave avenues of retreat open. There's a famous saying that you can win at everything. And that's true, even in diplomacy, because not all things that we talk over to or we decide to is we will always have the upper hand or we will always win. Sometimes we will lose, and that is why it's really important to have open retreats where you can call it a day or give up, but would not make your nation suffer or the other nation suffer. And that is all the rules of effective diplomacy. And now for the economic instrument, our group member, Jonna Camilon, will continue this report.
So hi, good morning. I'm Jonalisa Camilan from BSIS 13, and I will be here to discuss the economic instrument. So first is economic instrument. It is a way or process that can be used to reward or to punish between countries, and that involves foreign policy. So first is there are three purposes of trade instruments of foreign policy. The first one is to achieve foreign policy through utilizing needs and dependence, and wherein in this case the states may offer rewards or a threat which causes punishments. And then the second one is to increase capabilities, or in other term, they were able to take away the possibilities of the other states may had in their countries. So the third one is to create economic satellites that will be useful for states to achieve or of having economic dependence. And then when rewards are offered or economic punishment are threatened, at least two conditions may be fulfilled to make the exercise of influence effective. So the first one is the target of influence or act must perceive that there is a need of reward for avoidance for punishments. And then no alternative market of source or supplies must be available to the target. Thus, consequences is visible. So the specific techniques can be used to reward or punish between countries. There are tariffs, quotas, boycotts, and embargoes. Let's tackle first the tariffs. So tariffs is a tax imposed by one country on the services imported by another country. So like for example, tariff helps manufacturers in cities may hurt consumers that are in rural areas who do not benefit from the policy. One good sample is the farmers. And then the second one is the disadvantages of using tariffs as an instrument of for a country is they can make domestic industries less efficient, and also they can hurt domestic consumers like what I said. And then since there is a lack of competition tends to push up prices. And then the next one is quota. It is a limited quantity of particular product which under official control can be produced, exported or imported. And then like for example, the head of the company tells the sales target that will be needed to accomplish ahead of time. And then the next is boycott. It is an act of non-violent or voluntarily from using or dealing with a person. And then, regarding to Killian Hillman, the effectiveness of international trade boycotts as a special form of conflict between countries are not a new phenomenon. They have been used throughout history to punish a specific behavior. The second one is embargo. It is a government order that restricts commerce with a specified country. They are usually used as a result of unfavorable terms or unfavorable political or economic circumstances between countries. Like for example is a country can prevent its citizens or businesses from providing services to another country. So the next one is loans, credits, and currency manipulation. So it says that the manipulation of currency rates is also used to create more or less favorable terms of trade between the other countries. Because the reason why is to strengthen their international competitive positions, that other than that is to increase their trade surpluses. And then the next one is foreign aid. It is the money or capital of one country voluntarily transferred to another country for the benefit of the recipient country. And then the last is military aid. Oh, so what is military aid? It is used to assist a country or its people in defense efforts, or assist a poor country in maintaining control over over territory. So that's for today.
Hi guys, good morning. I am Daniela Alberto. I am here to talk about foreign policy objectives to long-range objectives. Foreign policy objectives is just like any policy, set short-term, middle-term, long-term goals and objectives to be achieved in proportion of a state's capability. In addition, the classification of foreign policy objectives, it is based on the three combination criteria. First, the value placed on the objective. Second, the time element placed on each achievement. And third, the kind of demands the objective imposes on the other state in the international system. Based on these objectives, it can be categorized as the core values and interest objectives or the short-range objectives, the middle-range objectives, and the long-range objectives. And now, I will explain the three combination of foreign policy objectives. First is the core values and interests or the short-range objectives. Core values and interests can be described as those kinds of goals for which most people are willing to make ultimate sacrifices. Short-range objectives are called core values as well because these objectives are attained at all cost. And also, core interests are sacrosanct by people receiving the state. What do we mean by sacrosanct? Sacrosanct is regarded as too important, valuable, and also respected. Based on my understanding, a state without any physical unity would cease to remain a state. That is why the core values and interest, it has to be the foremost objective of a state. Next part of core values and interests is extraterritoriality. Extraterritoriality is there when national interests and claims of a country is projected beyond the limit of its geographic boundary. In other words, extraterritoriality is a state being exempted from jurisdiction of a local law. It is usually the result of diplomatic negotiations. Still today, some countries such as Israel, United States of America, or USA still pursue this policy called extraterritoriality. Let's move on to the second objectives, which is the middle range objectives. The middle range objectives is drastically varies across states. The variation is due to the difference in the level of economic, technological progress, military capability, and the middle range objectives of a state. Yet, it can be said that the bottom point that a state would like to achieve in its medium term is to take a course of actions that have the highest impact on the domestic, economic, and welfare needs of expectation. But economic development and social welfare cannot be achieved through self-help, as most states have only limited resources, administrative services, and technical skills. Because of that, middle range objectives has interdependence. Interdependence means that to satisfy domestic needs and aspirations, states would have to interact with others. They used to trade, foreign aid, access to communication facilities, source of supply, and foreign market to increase their social welfare. With a very great demand, people have placed on governments to provide them jobs, incomes, recreation, medical services, and general security. Government increasingly have to develop policies to satisfy expectations of face political defeat. In this circumstance, it may be difficult to gain much support for other objectives such as glory, territorial expansion, power, and or power for its own sake. But the goal of a government is to pursue those course of actions that have the highest impact on domestic economic and welfare needs of people. Let us move to the last objectives, which is the long-range objectives. The long-range objectives has only two concepts, the goal of long-range and the difference between long-range and middle-range goal. Long-range goals are those plans, dreams, and visions concerning the ultimate political and ideological organizations of the international system and rules governing relations in that system. A state, while pursuing such type of objective, seeks to gain almost at the expenses of other states. Long-range objective has no time restrictions. Usually, the time limit employed to short-range objectives or the core interest and values, and the middle-range objectives. The difference between long-range goal and middle-range goal. In the middle-range goals, states makes particular demands against their particular interest. But pursuing the long-range goal, states normally make universal demands for their purpose is no less than to reconstruct an entire international system according to a universally applicable plan or vision. Long-range objective is not only time-consuming but also indefinite. That would be the end of my report. Thank you for listening.
So, Um, foreign policy behavior of a state basically implies the broad pattern of its foreign policies over time. Arnold Wolfers suggested that all foreign policy behavior ultimately boils down to three possible patterns. First one is self-preservation, which means maintaining the state of affairs. Second is self-extension, which means revising the state of affairs in one's own favor. Next is self-abnegation, which means revising the state of affairs in some else's favor. Okay, so next is foreign policy dimensions. Okay, so in the analysis of foreign policy behavior, we can also use foreign policy dimensions. So there are three foreign policy dimensions. First one is alignment. So what is alignment? Alignment is where you're aligned. Who are your allies? Or do you even consider having allies? There are three alignment tendencies. First one is alliances. Alliances, from the word itself, making allies with other countries, other states. Next is neutrality. Neutrality is basically following what the international law states a country should do to avoid wars. Lastly is non-alignment. Non-alignment is just not being aligned with or against any belligerents. Belligerents, this is the term used for countries that has a high tendency of engaging into combat or war. Okay, so second dimension, scope. Scope is a scope of a country's activities or interests. So it's pretty straightforward. Next is mode of operation. Mode of operation, because some countries often rely on multilateral institutions to address different issues.